So you've already heard the title, that is Elizabeth Anscombe, Cooperation, Thomas Aquinas, and Justice. When Professor Daniel Chile, director of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, invited me to give this year's Anscombe lecture, he noted, first of all, that the Institute is interested this year in exploring, by way of this lecture, the influence of Thomas Aquinas on Elizabeth Anscombe's philosophical thought, especially on her thinking about the concept of justice. He also mentioned that I might possibly draw upon my own work on cooperation with evil, which has just been mentioned. He was referring primarily, that is, to the book I published in 2019 entitled Cooperation with Evil. Some people say that the subtitle should be an autobiography, but it's actually Thomistic Tools of Analysis. As is indicated by this latter subtitle, its main purpose is to make use of Thomas Aquinas' ethical thought in the analysis of cooperation with evil. One does not find in Thomas's writings a systematic treatment of cooperation with evil, so the book is not an exposition of Thomas's understanding of cooperation, that is, strictly speaking. Rather, the central argument of the book is that placing the analysis of cooperation within the context of Thomas's understanding of human action, and ultimately justice, helps us better to understand the various types and degrees of cooperation with evil. Since philosophical accounts of cooperation with evil involve so crucially, but too often imprecisely, intention, in the book I mentioned, I make reference a number of times to Miss Anscombe, that is, her criticisms of a strain of Cartesian psychology, which was mentioned by Nick. And this Cartesian psychology understands intention, and I quote here, as an interior act of the mind which could be produced at will, unquote. And to her another remark, that the idea that one can determine one's intentions by making such a little speech to oneself, as she says, this is obviously bosh. That's kind of a typical statement by Elizabeth Anscombe. Nowhere in my book, however, do I develop the idea that there is a correspondence between Anscombe's understanding of intention and justice and Thomas's. So I welcome this opportunity to trace out this correspondence, which I now see, having studied this matter, as quite verifiable. I will proceed as follows. I begin with a summary of the Catholic Church's teaching on cooperation with evil, pointing to inadequacies in some of the major analyses of cooperation by certain authors within the so-called manualist tradition. In the subsequent section, I argue that these inadequacies are remedied by taking the Thomistic approach more seriously. In the two subsequent sections, I speak of Anscombe's concept of a moral landscape and her recognition of the category of implicit formal cooperation with evil. So I begin with simply the Church's kind of the standard magisterial teaching on cooperation with evil. The basic lineaments of the Church's teaching on cooperation with evil are fairly well known. Imagine an operating room in a hospital in which an abortion is being performed. The physician performing the abortion is, to use the standard term, pro-choice. He is not being coerced, for instance, in order to meet professional standards, to perform these abortions. Two medical students help him in the procedure itself, making sure that the mother is properly positioned, handing instruments to the abortionists, etc., etc. One of the students is, like the physician, pro-choice or pro-abortion. The other finds abortions repulsive, but is assisting in the procedure because he or she wants to be certified as a medical doctor. One could also presume that an anesthesiologist is involved in the procedure. This person, too, does not favor abortion, and his or her provision of the anesthetics is not part of the procedure itself. We might even suppose that he administers the anesthesia and leaves the operating room before the abortionist and his assistants arrive. Finally, pushing a cart throughout the hospital and delivering supplies to his various departments, that is, the emergency room, intensive care, surgery, etc., is another man whose job includes leaving supplies, including instruments, at the desk outside the operating room where the abortions are performed. I will be referring to the physician performing the abortion as the malefactor. It's kind of standard practice. Standard Catholic teaching speaks of the activity of the pro-choice medical student as formal cooperation. A formal cooperator shares in the intention of the malefactor. The activity of the other, that is, the reluctant medical student, is called implicit formal cooperation. The inclusion of such cooperation within the formal is consistent with Pope Innocent XI's 1679 condemnation of the following laxist position, often associated with Jesuits, actually. And here's a quotation. And this is so he's condemning this idea. That is, and I quote, "A servant who, offering his shoulders, knowingly helps his master to climb through a window in order to violate a virgin, and often assists him by carrying a ladder, opening a gate, or cooperating in some similar way, does not sin mortally if he does this out of fear of notable injury, lest, for instance, he be ill-treated by the master, or be subject to angry looks, or be expelled from the house." End of quotation. Pope Innocent is, in effect, asserting here that even though the servant does not share the intention of his master, he may indeed be opposed to such immoral sexual behavior. Nonetheless, his cooperation is mortally sinful. Innocent, that is, Pope Innocent, does not employ the expressions formal cooperation or implicit formal cooperation. These expressions, in fact, were not yet in use among moral theologians. In her essay, War and Murder, Anscombe associates the position condemned by Innocent with, again, the Cartesian psychology, which I've already mentioned. So then, the standard account of church teaching on cooperation of evil will recognize two types of formal cooperation: that in which the cooperator shares the intention of the malefactor, and that in which the cooperator does not, although the latter cooperation is still implicitly formal. The standard teaching also recognizes various levels of material cooperation. In the scene proposed earlier, the cooperation of the anesthesiologist, who does not favor abortion and whose actions are not part of the abortion procedure itself, can be termed immediate material cooperation. The activity of the man pushing a cart through the hospital and delivering supplies can be termed mediate cooperation, or even remote material cooperation. Immediate material cooperation is standardly classified as immoral. So this second section, it's basically on St. Alphonsus of Liguori. Before moving on how Thomas Aquinas and Elizabeth Anscombe would analyze these various types of cooperation, it will behoove us to say something about how St. Alphonsus of Liguori, in fact, does the same. That is, not only because he was enormously influential in the development of the teaching of cooperation on cooperation, but also because problems in his account point to ways in which Thomistic, and in fact, Anscombian, I suppose that's approach can be of use. Alphonsus was canonized in 1839, 52 years after his death, and was declared a doctor of the church in 1871. And he's often referred to as the doctor of the church most dedicated to moral theology. He is the principal author, that's an issue actually, of the enormously influential multi-volume work, Theologia Moralis. Alphonsus states in that work that a servant who writes or conveys amorous letters to his master's lover, even if he does these things out of grave fear of punishment, cooperates formally. And in another work, not the Theologia Moralis, he asserts that someone who acts as a lookout for a thief or an assassin cooperates formally, and that such similar acts, and I quote, for no reason, not even that of death, can they be dismissed as not mortal sin, end of quote. Alphonsus is in effect affirming here that some formal cooperation is implicit. In his Theologia Moralis, he speaks of contributing to the will of the malefactor, as distinct from contributing to the malefactor's action, regarded as something outside of which the material cooperator stands, an action delimited and distinct from whatever contributing act the material cooperator may perform. In other words, if you think of the action itself of abortion, standing outside of that and looking at an action as an objective thing, that person who is so thinking and standing outside of it is cooperating with the action itself as objectively independent of himself. He may actually still be doing so immorally, but to actually enter into that system, which Alphonsus refers to as entering into the will, that involves formal cooperation. To quote Alphonsus himself, having first mentioned the way in which certain authors before him had distinguished formal and material cooperation, he asserts, and I quote, "But it is better, with yet others, to say that cooperation is formal, which contributes to the bad will of the other and cannot be without sin, but that cooperation is material, which contributes only to the bad action of the other, beside the intention of the cooperator." Alphonsus is acknowledging here that a formal cooperator need not have the same intention as the malefactor. The servant conveying amorous letters and the person serving as lookout do not share the intention of the malefactor, but they do enter into what he wills. One who cooperates formally, even implicitly, does enter into the will of the malefactor. As we shall see shortly, a similar approach is to be found in Thomas Aquinas. But Alphonsus also says some things which are difficult to reconcile with the idea that some formal cooperation can be implicit. He speaks, that is, of a person who, under grave pressure, opens for a thief a strongbox, a safe, and he argues that such behavior is merely material cooperation because the act performed is of indifferent moral character. For he argues, if we do not say this, and I quote, "If a thief forces you to open your own strongbox in order to hand over to him the money there contained, you could not do this without sinning. You would be formally cooperating in his sin." The problem here is that pretty much anything, writing an amorous letter to one's wife, for instance, or serving as a lookout, lest an enemy might see that someone is shifting his own goods to a safer location, can be conceived of as an indifferent act. It would seem then that the only way in which such actions might be classified as moral cooperation is if the cooperator intends that which the malefactor intends. This basic idea entered into some standard analyses of cooperation as the principle that, and I quote, another's wickedness cannot alter the nature of your action. So that's a principle that's found in some of the manualists. There are, therefore, philosophical problems, inconsistencies in Alphonsus's account of formal cooperation, problems stemming from his understanding of morally indifferent acts. As I shall explain shortly more fully, adopting Thomas Aquinas' understanding that there are no concrete, morally indifferent human acts allows one to avoid the inconsistencies that vitiate Alphonsus's and others' account of cooperation with evil. It appears that Alphonsus was made aware of the inconsistencies in his own account, for in an edition of the Theologia Moralis that appeared in 1767, that is 4 years after Alphonsus was made bishop of Sant'Agata dei Goti in southern Italy, there is inserted, that is towards the end, a tractatus entitled On Human Acts in General, in which is set out Thomas's understanding on indifferent acts. The main text, however, of the Theologia Moralis, that is the problematic passages, remains unaltered, obviously because he was busy as a bishop. So let me now enter into talk about Thomas Aquinas and the divisions of cooperation with evil. As is apparent, I hope, from what has been said so far, of central importance in the analysis of cooperation is intention. Thomas Aquinas' action theory is essentially Aristotelian, and although in his writings on human action, Aristotle does not employ a term corresponding to the term intention, he does refer to intention indirectly. I mean, if we want to get into the details of that, we can do that. That is, whether Aristotle actually uses the term. Thomas's question on intention in the Summa Theologiae begins with an article which asks, and I quote, whether the intention is an act of the intellect or the will, that is, the voluntas. Thomas's answer is, as always, very careful. He holds with Aristotle that motion in man issues from appetite, and that the will is an appetite, that is, an erexis. And so his answer to the question posed is ultimately that, and I quote, intention is, properly speaking, an act of the will. He also holds, however, that unlike the mere appetites, desire, and spiritedness, thumos, these are Platonic ideas, the will enters into the reasoning part of the soul, even though it's an appetite. This entails that the scope of the agent's will is quite broad. It takes in everything that he knows he is doing. But it also entails that what is within that scope is precisely segmented and understood as such. An agent knows the end that he pursues by way of a particular act, and in a different way, and possibly in great detail, he knows the things he believes or hopes will lead to that end, the things which are often referred to as the means. Again, that's another term which is a source of controversy. So let me, I'm going to try to be very slow here because this is a bit complicated. So the agent's knowing of the end, Thomas calls his intention. It is important to bear in mind that an agent's intention is a straight line of intelligibility. Aristotle compares it to an archer's aiming at a target, but also that it is not unconnected with the things that are for the end, that is the means, the basic action. At Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae 12:4, which we'll come back to a couple times, Thomas asks whether, and I quote, the intention of the end and the will of that which is for the end constitute one and the same movement. Notice again the juxtaposition of intention and will. One notices immediately that he maintains the distinction between that which aims at the end, that is the intention, that particular part, that particular exercise of the will, and that which embraces also that which is for the end, that is the will. In the body of that article, 12:4, he also makes another distinction. First of all, if one considers the two things mentioned in the article's title absolutely and as they are in themselves, as he says, that is the intention of the end and the will specifically of that which is for the end, then one must simply say that there are two distinct movements of the will, one towards the end, the other towards that which is for the end. So strictly speaking, he says they're distinct. On the other hand, if one considers that the will is born towards that which is for the end, precisely on account of the end, then one can say truthfully that one and the same movement of the will is tending, tendens is the word he uses, tending toward the end and is also in that which is for the end. So the intention enters into the means, the larger picture. In speaking of the one movement of the will as tending towards the end, he is in fact referring to intention. In speaking of that very moment, intention as in that which is for the end, he is denying that the movement of the will which is toward that which is for the end is the intention, but he's also asserting that that intention is in those components of the act of the things, or in that which is done for the end. It is not impossible that when Alphonsus associates formal cooperation, including implicit formal cooperation, not with the intention of the malefactor, but rather with his bad will, he has in mind, that is 12:4, Prima Secundae 12:4. This is not to say, however, that Thomas ever proposed a distinction between these two types of cooperation. Nowhere in Thomas's works is there to be found a treatise on cooperation with evil. That said, however, what he does say about the relationship between intention and will provides support for the idea that an agent's action, even if he does not share the intention of the malefactor, can be conceived of as bound up with the bad will of the malefactor, which is not unconnected with his intention. That Thomas recognizes that an agent's action might in this way be bound up with the bad will of another is connected with the problem in Alphonsus's analysis of cooperation, that is the problem I identified earlier. It is connected, that is, with the idea that there are indifferent acts, indifferent human acts. As mentioned earlier, the idea found its way into the thought of later moral theologians as the principle that another's wickedness cannot alter the nature of your action. Thomas's response to this assertion would surely be, well, why not? Our acts are assessed with respect to the way they cohere with the precepts of justice, which is itself about the way in which the actions of individuals fit into the society of which they are part. And so the situation in which something is done, even if it's not all the agent's responsibility, can in fact have an effect on the nature of the act that you're doing. An act, so long as it is truly a voluntary act, if it is not an immoral act, will be a good act, according to Thomas. This leaves no room for indifference. We can posit a particular act that's considered as an autonomously singular act is without blemish, handing an instrument to another person who asks for it, for instance. If the context in which this handing over occurs is similarly without blemish, then the act is good. It's not indifferent. But if the instrument is handed to an abortionist, even though the one handing over the instrument does not share the intention of the abortionist, the moral character of the malefactor's act has entered into the cooperator's act. That is to say, it has entered into his will. It does not enter in completely. The assistant has not killed the child, but he has formally cooperated in the killing of a child. All this is just to say that the determination of justice, the moral assessment of human acts, is about whether a person's actions are consistent with sound moral principles of the society or existing in the society of which he is a part. Thomas Aquinas speaks at one point of the circumstances when and where, such as might enter into an act and characterize that act morally. If the supposedly indifferent act of handing an instrument to another person occurs in an operating room while an abortion is being performed, then that is not a good and certainly not an indifferent act, but rather an act of gross injustice. The injustice depends not upon the intention of the agent, or to use Anscombe's words, upon an interior act of the mind, but upon the act's moral status within society, or within a particular context in which the act is performed. So I come finally to Anscombe. As with Thomas Aquinas, one does not find in Elizabeth Anscombe's writings a systematic treatment of cooperation with evil. This is not to say that she does not speak, even fairly often, of instances of possible cooperation, discussing also their moral character. In her essay, Action, Intention, and Double Effect, for instance, she writes that, and I quote, that you can't build roads and fast vehicles, you can't have various sports and races, you can't have ships voyaging over the seas without its being predictable that there will be deaths resulting. End of quotation. She goes on then to say that in such matters, and I quote again, we are helped by thinking of the deaths as either remote or uncertain. The people building such vehicles and ships might be said to cooperate in the deaths they know will result from their products, but the cooperation, if it can even be called that, is so remote that it could not, by any reasonable person, be called immoral cooperation. In a very interesting manuscript found in the Anscombe archive, Anscombe addresses the distinction between accidental and perhaps negligent killing and murder. And I quote, now for remoteness, she says. And it's in the middle of one of these documents. Let us suppose that the camber, I should explain, camber is a British term which I didn't know before, but it actually has to do with a slant of a roof or of a street, which is built in order to take care of curves, etc. And so that's what she said. So let us suppose that the camber of a road at a certain point is responsible for numerous accidents. So it's not steep enough. Many of those fatal, and that this road, this is all a quotation from Anscombe, and that this road had this camber by the action of a particular workman. If this was accidental, we may find it strained to say that the road layer killed those whose deaths came about from such accidents. However, we only have to suppose malice on the part of the road layer, the worker, a calculated mislaying here on purpose to produce fatal accidents. And not only the word kill, but the epithet murder becomes appropriate. Immediately after these words, she makes a remark that tells us much about her approach to ethics in general, and about her more profound philosophical convictions. She says, that is, that her just completed identification of murder as related to, but distinct from, accidental killing, and I quote, gives us a sudden insight into the complex nature of murder, as by a momentary flash, an elaborate landscape may be illuminated briefly. It does not connote spiteful feelings, but badness of intent. End of quote. For Anscombe, the ambit of ethics is indeed a landscape. To engage in ethical analysis is to pay close attention to what in the moral universe, the moral landscape we inhabit, we instinctively regard as a good action or a bad action. One sees this approach also in her consideration of the principle of double effect. She does not deny that this intellectual device is a principle, that is a principle in ethics, sound ethics. Its origin can be traced back to Thomas Aquinas, in particular his article Secunda 64:7, which is about the liceity of killing in self-defense, and the corpus of which begins with the words, "Nothing prohibits there being of one act two effects, of which only one is in the intention, but the other beside the intention." Thomas Aquinas goes on then to say that an act of self-defense might be moral insofar as the death of the attacker is not in the intention of the self-defender. But although Anscombe recognizes this principle, that is the principle of double effect, as a principle, she regards it as simply a potential aid in accounting for moral distinctions we already recognize as present in the moral landscape. Again, that concept, landscape, very important. Certain philosophers and moral theologians see things the wrong way around. They understand, according to Anscombe, also myself, they understand the principles as something that determines the moral character of an act, waiting for the application of the principle. And so if a philosopher or theologian argues, for instance, that since killing an attacker is with the intention simply of saving one's own life is morally acceptable, similarly, therefore, acceptable is the crushing of a fetus's skull with the intention of saving the life of its mother. That is, if we find if we find that sort of an equivalent, we can say that philosopher or that theologian is moving in the wrong direction, beginning not from the acts recognized in the landscape, some of which fall under the principle of double effect, but beginning rather from the principle which is then imposed upon the acts in the landscape, thereby supposedly bestowing upon them their moral character. Such a use of the principle of double effect lends itself to what, as we have seen, Anscombe calls Cartesian psychology, the idea that one can determine one's own intentions by making such a speech to oneself about what one was intending. Anscombe approaches not so much, however, what I might call a nose flat to the ground approach, but rather an approach that recognizes that we live in a moral universe that we share with other rational animals, who also recognize, or can be brought to recognize, the moral character of the various acts present in the moral landscape. In an essay entitled "Has Mankind One Soul?", Anscombe states that, and I quote, "the intellective principle is the differentia of the human soul." Employing an example that surely originated in the Geach-Anscombe household, this intellective principle, she says, and I quote, is manifest in various ways. The one we are most likely to be conscious of in philosophy nowadays is language, its syntax, its application and aptness in circumstances, the logical multifariousness of its bits, and the connection of one sentence with others in a whole context of sentences. Why are you not in bed? I ask a child of 3 years old, and get an answer, I haven't yet had my bath. And basically the idea is, you couldn't have that sort of conversation with a dog, and of that complexity, and that complexity, those little bits, especially when we're talking about morals, that is the landscape of which she's speaking. A verbal exchange of that complexity could never occur between a master and his dog. But Anscombe's main point here is that the only way truly to understand how language works is not to develop a theory of the way in which raw input from the senses is transmuted into replicate ideas and then into words, but rather to notice the way that people in conversation understand one another spontaneously. One notices Anscombe's talk of the, and I quote again, the logical multifariousness of language's bits, and of the connection of one sentence with others in a whole context of sentences. A similar or even the same thing occurs in non-theoretically driven conversation about moral acts. Together as fellow citizens occupying the same moral space with others, we take notice of the multifarious moral characters of acts, the bits that make up our moral landscape. Perhaps, though, speaking of bits is also a bit misleading, or at least requires elucidation. Anscombe does share with her child linguistic bits, but all such linguistic bits are integral parts of a language, and indeed of a complex web of a language. This is why she speaks of language's syntax, its application and aptness in circumstances. Similarly, the human acts of possible immoral cooperation that might come under moral scrutiny are integral parts of a complex, intertwined system with as many as various factors. Sorry, I lost my place here. So this intertwining means that contrary to what we find occasionally in Alphonsus of Liguori, no such human acts can be considered indifferent acts. They're always within a context. All human acts are subject to judgment as either just or unjust, depending upon their aptness in circumstances. And so some acts of cooperation will be judged so remote, so distant from the malefactor, as not to constitute violations of justice. Others, even when the cooperator does not share the intention of the malefactor, will certainly be unjust. So this is the last section, I'm sure you'll be glad. So, and this section is entitled Anscombe and Wittgenstein on Implicit Formal Cooperation. That brings us to another concept in the traditional understanding of cooperation with evil. As we have seen, the latter category of acts in which a cooperator enters into what the malefactor wills but does not share his intention is called traditionally implicit formal cooperation. Anscombe, in effect, speaks of the latter in her book Intention, although it must be said also that the analysis she conducts is more fine-grained than we find in the traditional teaching. And the vocabulary she employs is not precisely the vocabulary in that teaching, that is, that we find in the Magisterium. Anscombe puts forth in intention the well-known example or examples of carrying out the plan of an employer by pumping poisoned water into a house inhabited by persons that the employer wants killed. The occupants of the house are described as actively engaged in extermination of Jews and possibly planning a world war. So it is not impossible to consider the employer not as a malefactor, but as acting justly. That is the employer who wants to poison them. But we can also alter this scenario without altering the analytical basis by supposing that the occupants of the house are in fact innocent targets whom the employer, a true malefactor, simply despises. Anscombe also speaks of a series of possible descriptions of an employee's action, moving his arm up and down, operating the pump, replenishing the water supply, and poisoning the inhabitants. She posits, however, two different scenarios or characters engaged in such pumping. The first does not intend poisoning the inhabitants. The second, she insists, must be so regarded. Regarding the first employee, she writes, and I quote, "He is being improbably confidential and is asked, 'Why did you replenish the house water supply with poisoned water?' His reply is not to polish them off, but I didn't care about that. I wanted my pay and just did my usual job." In that case, she continues, although he knows concerning an intentional act of his for it, namely replenishing the water supply, is intentional by our criteria, that it is also an act of replenishing the house water supply with poisoned water. It would be incorrect by our criteria to say his act of replenishing the house supply with poisoned water was intentional. So she actually, at that point, she denies that it was intentional. As for the second pumper, she alters the circumstances, but only slightly. And again, I quote, "On the other hand, if, say, this was not his normal job, but he was hired by the poisoner to pump the water, knowing that it was poisoned, the case is different. He can say he doesn't care a tuppence and that he only wants the money, but the commission by the acceptance and performance of which he gets the money is, however implicit this is allowed to be, to pump poisoned water." A theologian or philosopher applying the traditional terminology would describe the first employee as engaged in implicit formal cooperation. But according to Anscombe's more fine-grained analysis, the second employee, although claiming not to share the intention of the malefactor, does share it, and so is engaged in what we might call explicit formal cooperation, but still formal cooperation. That is, formal cooperation, simply speaking. In any case, both these employees are so within the procedure put together by the malefactor that neither of their activities can be described as merely material cooperation. That is, cooperator number 2 is not against the killing. He's not against the killing, even if he says he is just doing what he was explicitly hired in order to do. What is said about the second employee is of considerable, in fact, more relevant philosophical interest. Anscombe says of him that he cannot profess not to have had the intention of doing the thing that was a means to an end of his. And then she quotes a remark by Wittgenstein, in which, as is typical of Wittgenstein, he first proposes an idea and immediately goes against it, or answers it, replies to what he says. And so Wittgenstein writes this. He says, I'm not ashamed of what I did then, but of the intention which I had. Then his response, and didn't the attention reside also in what I did? What justifies the shame? The whole history of the incident. End of quotation. It would have been completely out of character, but Wittgenstein at this point could very well have cited Thomas Aquinas' Prima Secundae 12.4. That is the article we have examined, in which the angelic doctor argues that the intention of the end and the will of that which is for the end are one and the same movement. One cannot, without falling into Cartesian psychology, say that one's intention is quite separate from what one does in order to realize the intention. Being ashamed of just one's intention, but not of what is for that intention, in other words, being ashamed of only a part of the whole history of the incident, makes no sense at all, as Wittgenstein says. Having quoted Wittgenstein's remark, Anscombe goes on to describe it, and I quote, as an antidote against the absurd thesis which is sometimes maintained that a man's intended action is only described by describing his objective. End of quote. Then she then applies Wittgenstein's antidote to the case of the employer who was only doing his usual job, that is, the first man. That is the case of the pumper whose activity, employing the traditional categories, would be described as implicit formal cooperation, even though he did not share in any sense the intention of the malefactor. Says Anscombe, even if what that employee says is true, that is, he says, I didn't care about the poisoning, I wanted my pay and just did my usual job, and I continue to quote, that will not absolve him from guilt of murder. End of quote. Having an intention other than that of the malefactor does not separate a cooperator from that malefactor's evil will. That is, the evil will present in the things that are done for the sake of that malefactor's intention. So I conclude. Briefly, and very briefly, that Elizabeth Anscombe's Wittgensteinian influenced analysis of cooperation with a malefactor is consistent with Alphonsus's more coherent and more optimistic account of cooperation with evil. It is quite possible to cooperate formally, but only implicitly, in the action set up by a malefactor, even if one does not share the intention of that malefactor, but only enters into the larger ambit of the action which he wills. Thank you.